Great. Allow me to start then. My name is Andreas Toniades, and I'm a senior lecturer in global political economy at the University of Sussex. And I have the pleasure and the honor to moderate today's webinar. On behalf of all our organizations and donors, I would like to say a very warm welcome to the webinar on financial crisis, poverty, and environmental sustainability. The webinar is part of a joint initiative by the Poverty and Environment Action, the UNDP UNEP, of the United Nations Research Institute in Social Development, and of the Sussex Sustainability Research Programme of the University of Sussex. The main aim of our initiative is to advance the state of the art in our understanding of how poverty and the environment interact in conditions of financial crisis, and of course, what needs to be done in this regard. Let me first of all give the floor for a brief welcome to our host today, Anne Eupner, the co-director of the Poverty and Environment Initiative of the United Nations. Anne, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Andreas. And indeed, it's a great pleasure to have this webinar today. Allow me to start with just a few opening reflections. UNDP's Human Development Report Office has noted that because of the current pandemic and related financial crisis, low and medium human development countries face income and livelihood losses due to mandated confinement policies and other mitigation measures. At the same time, they are more constrained in the policy space regarding fiscal and monetary instruments to cope with the economic effects of the pandemic. Sovereign debt levels, which were already elevated prior to the pandemic, have increased further, threatening debt sustainability. In the absence of corrective and forward-looking actions, there is a severe risk of debt crisis that will hamper achievement of the 2030 agenda. UNDP has also estimated that the number of people living in extreme poverty in the low and medium human development countries could increase to between 626 million under a COVID baseline scenario and 753 million people under a high damage scenario. Financial crisis and COVID have also seen effects on the environment. Empirical evidence based on a large number of financial crises over the period between 1970 and 2014 shows positive environmental effects associated with financial crisis. For instance, reductions in atmospheric emissions, but these are short-lived. The current pandemic crisis seems to follow the same pattern. Temporary decreases in pollutant emissions and increases in water quality, but also an increase in destructive practices such as increases in plastic pollution and waste, and increase in tropical logging due to reduced monitoring and enforcement and green investments. The UNDP UNEP Poverty Environment Action for Sustainable Development Goals, or PAER project, in collaboration with the Sussex University Sustainability Research Programme, SSRP, and the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, UNRISD, have published a compilation of studies on the interplay among financial distress, poverty dynamics, and environmental sustainability to foster a better understanding of the multiple, complex, and often opposing ways and channels through which financial crisis, poverty dynamics, and environmental sustainability interact, and to offer timely and unique contributions to the immediate global challenge of sustainable development. The policy recommendations from these studies and other sources have been compiled with a view to preparing a brief for policymakers to better understand and address poverty and environment impacts of financial crisis. We are very pleased to have the opportunity today to present the related policy recommendations, and we look forward to your thoughts and feedback. Lastly, I would like to appreciate that this is a joint webinar between PAER, the University of Sussex in the UK, and UNRISD. Colleagues will have an opportunity to introduce themselves in the webinar, but I would like to say a very special welcome to Isabel Kampf, who is now with UNRWA, but used to work as peer co-director with me. So thank you, Isabel, for coming back to the family. It's very nice to see you and for agreeing to facilitate today's webinar. And thank you also to today's moderator, Dr. Andreas Antoniadis, Senior Lecturer in Global Political Economy of the University of Sussex. Thank you, and back over to you, Andreas.
Great, thank you very much, Anna, and Gorm, thanks one more time for all your great support and cooperation throughout our initiative. Before we proceed with our presentations, allow me a very brief introductory remarks from my side too. Indeed, the Sustainable Development Goals are implemented in an environment of heightened financial distress. I think Anne has outlined the key challenges. 40% of low-income countries were already in debt distress before the pandemic. 85 countries have already approached the IMF for some form of financial support during the pandemic. As Anne said, we are now experiencing absolute rises in people living in extreme poverty. So we are moving exactly in the opposite direction than the one aspired by the Sustainable Development Goals in the Agenda 2030. The increase in debt service has started to threaten the provision of basic services and needs, food, health, education, social care, and threatens the environment too. Environmental poverty is rising in an ever larger number of emerging, especially emerging and developing countries. And of course, the climate crisis reduces the time and the tools we have to respond to these adverse dynamics. The aim of our initiative in this context was exactly to map and analyze the links among financial distress, poverty, and environmental sustainability, so as to offer new evidence, so as to offer new insight on how we can manage, if you will, our transition to sustainability. We have worked together with a very wide network of partners who were very lucky across the globe, and we have already produced a wide number of studies at both regional, national, and subnational levels. In our webinar today, what we are trying to do is mostly three things. First, to present some new evidence on the environmental impact of financial crisis. Second, to present the idea or the strategy better of the need for a new eco-social contract as the way forward, as the way of managing our transition to a green and fair recovery from the pandemic. And third, to present a range of policy recommendations stemming from our network, but also from several other networks and organizations. Therefore, we would be very grateful for your feedback on our recommendations, and we would also like to hear from you in terms of existing or new innovative policy recommendations that you have and we could integrate in our work. Given the limited time, without further ado, let me proceed with our first joint presentation with Dr. Alexander Antonarakis, who is a senior lecturer in global change ecology at the Department of Geography at the University of Sussex. Alex, thank you for starting to share our screen. I will just say some brief things about the first slide, and then Alex will go ahead and present the key findings from our research. Alex, would you like to go to the first slide? Yes, perfect. That is the slide. What we are trying to do in this slide is to summarize, to capture, if you will, the key factors, channels, findings that determine the relationship, between financial crisis, poverty, and environmental sustainability. As I said, I will briefly explain the graph, and hopefully we will have more time to discuss it in our Q&A. But we now have seen from our research that poverty and inequality is a key driver, a key source for financial crisis. So poverty and inequality leads to financial crisis, but at the same time, financial crisis exacerbate conditions of poverty and inequality. And this increase in poverty and inequality as a result of the financial crisis leads to conditions of environmental degradation. Okay, essentially a wide range of factors: consumption patterns, investment patterns, production patterns shift to a low quality environment, environmentally speaking, if you will, mode, and these and the policy priorities at the same time of the states in conditions of financial crisis is to get growth rates, okay, to increase growth rates. So the speed overrides, if you will, the speed for growth rates overrides all other social and environmental considerations. So the growth that we see coming right during and after the financial crisis is to a great part based on unsustainable patterns, unsustainable growth. And the problem with this is that having growth that is based on unsustainable patterns, socio-environmentally speaking, leads to reduced social and environmental resilience. Okay, both in terms of, for instance, labor rights, but also in terms of the quality of the environment, the quality of biodiversity, and so on. And we have a range of studies in our network that demonstrate that reduced socio-environmental resilience leads to increased borrowing costs. So not only the environment takes a huge hit, if you will, but the fact that this happens leads to increase in borrowing costs. And the more exposed a country is to climate change, the higher the borrowing cost. This leads to downgrades, of course, from rating agencies, and this could lead, you know, again, to higher borrowing costs or for states to be cut off from market access. But in any case, both the increased cost in servicing the debt and the reduced access to markets leads to reduced fiscal space. So the states at that moment have less resources to deal with the sources of the crisis. Okay, the poverty and inequality that gave rise, if you will, to the crisis in the first place, and because they have less resources to do this in many cases leads to increased socio-political instability, if not social unrest. And this again triggers another round of downgrades from credit rating agencies that increase again the cost of borrowing, or, you know, difficulty in accessing financing in international markets, capital markets. And of course, all this leads to slower growth that exacerbates the crisis. And all these conditions, of course, create another cycle of a financial distress or a financial crisis. I don't have much time to go in detail in the graph, but the key question is how you break away from this vicious crisis. In the context of COVID-19, how we can use the COVID-19 crisis as an opportunity to break away from exactly these vicious cycles. We are coming back to this in our presentation with Isabel, but for the time being, let me pass the floor to Alexander to continue with our presentation.
Thank you, Andreas. So I'm Alexander Antonarakis, a senior lecturer at the University of Sussex in terrestrial ecology. So I'm a natural scientist, not an economist, which makes this collaboration with Andreas and you and Rist and all of you even more exciting. So I will present some of the key results that we have related to financial crisis and their impacts on select environmental indicators and on poverty. In a number of studies that we have done with Andreas. So first, I would like to present the impacts of financial crisis on air quality and atmospheric emissions, and overall, using over 150 countries and 44 or 45 years of crisis data, we see that there is an overall beneficial effect towards air quality and atmospheric emissions, and that there is a fall during the years of crisis. There is a fall in emissions, in carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrate emissions shortly after the break of the crisis. We see there's no effect in particulate emissions, but when there is a larger crisis with an output loss, or when there's a crisis with a GDP change, then the magnitude of the decrease in these air pollutants decreases during the impact of the crisis, and we have this impact of particulate emissions as well. We also see that there is that the higher income countries experience the most comprehensive reductions in these three atmospheric emissions: carbon dioxide, sulfates, and nitrates. But overall, the crisis effect on air quality disappears, or even in some cases reverses 1 or 2 years after the start of the crisis. So we see in this graph that we have decreases of these molecules within the first 2 years, but then there's a sort of a mixed picture. We have carbon dioxide, which has sporadic decreasing over time, but we have this dangerous PM 2.5, the particulate matter, that tends to increase afterwards. So essentially, this degrowth, or the punctuated degrowth caused by the financial crisis, does not offer any longer-term solution to air pollution. We also investigated the impact of financial crises on deforestation, looking at the period in the 21st century, 2001, 2017. And we have found, again, a beneficial effect of financial crises on deforestation, where we see globally a decrease or a fall in deforestation, so around 36 percentage points, with large effects, the largest effects in Asia, in Africa, and in Europe, with no significance in America. We have also found that there's a large impact on lower income groups than on higher income groups. So there's a larger decrease in deforestation rates in lower income groups than higher income groups. Then we wanted to ask, why is this happening? Is there a decrease in the major commodities that are drivers of deforestation? And so we looked at adjacent decreases or changes or impacts rather of financial crisis on timber production and agricultural commodities. And in agricultural commodities, we chose the main tropical commodities: cattle, cocoa, palm oil, and soybean. And we find overall that there is a decrease in timber production over the crisis periods, a decrease in cattle production, and a decrease in cocoa. Regionally, we find different drivers for the different continents, where we find that the timber production decreases a lot in Asia. We have changes in palm oil, in this case, an increase in palm oil, which is a bit conflicting, but we think that there is intensification of palm oil going on in areas of Southeast Asia, which may not affect this change in deforestation. In other continents, such as Africa, we find further evidence of decrease, where we find palm oil production is decreasing, soybean is decreasing, as well as cocoa. So there's an overall decrease in the main drivers of deforestation. Now, the impact on poverty of financial crisis is inverse, in that we see an overall worsening impact of the financial crisis on poverty. Overall, we find no indicators that are beneficial. Here we've separated them into income, basic needs, health, and education. So going through these quickly, in terms of income, we find that poverty headcount increases and poverty gap increases globally, with larger effects on low-income countries than on higher-income countries. Basic needs, the access to electricity and the access to sanitation, also decrease globally, with more impacts in lower-income countries. Infant mortality increases globally, and maternal mortality also increases in lower-income groups. Maternal mortality has no effect globally. Education, also very worryingly, the children out of school increases, as does the government education expenditure decrease globally. Again, with larger impacts in lower income countries but in the government expenditure, there's a huge impact throughout the income groups except for high income. So very worrying picture for poverty over the years of financial crisis. And this is from the 1970s onwards. So we took the full span of financial crises in the last 45 years. We also wanted to break away from just periods of financial crisis to look at periods of slower economic growth rates. And so we defined this period after the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, where we have seen a procession of slower growth rates since then, or what Andreas likes to call the new normal. And so we coined that the Great Stagnation Period. And so we wanted to see what this slower growth rate or this prolonged slower growth rate period has on environment specifically. We have not looked at poverty, unfortunately, in this case. So here we find limited and mixed results for the impact of this Great Stagnation Period on environment. Specifically, we find limited to mixed results in atmospheric emissions and forests, where we find no significant evidence globally. We find some evidence of carbon dioxide emissions in low-income countries, or increasing and decreasing in high-income countries. Particulate matter decreases in the middle-income countries. And in forests, we find no significant evidence of change at global level, and some evidence of decreasing in Asia and in upper middle-income countries. On the other side of the coin, we find that forest cover, which was another indicator we used from the European Space Agency, we found that decreases in low-income countries and high-income countries. So a conflicting picture with a deforestation data set we have. Now, we do find another worrying impact of this longer, slower growth rate period on biodiversity. We find that this Great Stagnation has a worsening condition globally on biodiversity, both in terrestrial biodiversity and in marine biodiversity, using these 5 data sets. The effects are more pronounced in higher income countries, especially related to the marine protected areas. In the Americas, it's dominated by the terrestrial protected areas, so the amount of land area that's protected as national parks. In Africa, we find that species protection and fish stocks are decreasing. And in Europe, we find that species protection and marine protected areas are also decreasing. So brief takeaway messages from these results, and I apologize for all the graphs, is that financial crises do not have a unidirectional effect on the environment, although they show some improvements in air pollution, emissions, and deforestation. Yet we also do find that the years subsequent to the crisis cancel out any of these effects on air pollution, that we see that in particular emissions, specifically nitrates, we find increases after a few years of the crisis. The financial crisis impact on poverty is clear, and that we have an overall worsening impact on poverty. So faster economic growth rates do cause environmental damage, but the slower economic growth rates that we found in financial crisis and in the Great Stagnation, they do not ensure environmental benefits and sustainability. So this essentially means that our need to transition to sustainability will not come if we just put it on autopilot, if we just rely on the swings in economic production and performance. So I'm going to go through some brief recommendations, and I'll pass over to Andreas as well, arising from our work. So one thing that we have seen with the COVID recovery packages recently, at the end of this crisis period, hopefully it's ending, is that a lot of the so-called green recovery packages are focusing mainly on climate change initiatives, which is great, focusing on greener infrastructure and renewable energies. But there is limited funding and limiting funding stated for ecosystem-related recovery. So things like biodiversity, nature-based solution, forest protection, and ecosystem recovery. Only a fraction, less than 1% of the funding is going to ecosystem-related recovery. So this needs to be enhanced. Second, that there needs to be more knowledge sharing between nations when they're trying to address the sustainable development goals in order to find synergies, in order to share their success in finding these synergies. And especially in my case, in our case, it's about finally breaking this link between commodity production, so timber, agricultural commodities, mining, and so on, and the natural land. And something that's also close to us in terms of reporting the Sustainable Development Goals, we need to have better terrestrial as well as marine data sets when we're monitoring and we're recording success towards the Sustainable Development Goals. Especially when it comes to land, we need better yearly monitoring. We need to understand the disturbance history and the recovery better, and the landscape heterogeneity within each of these satellite products. So I will pass over to Andreas now to talk to us briefly about his recommendations. Andreas.
Thank you, Alexander. We only have 2 minutes, so I will again try to be brief. The main point of this slide is to say that we do not have, we have limited resources at global level, and we would not have the luxury to first solve the economic crisis, the economic impact of the COVID-19 crisis, and then tend to the environment. This, simply put, means that the only way forward is to better align and, where possible, integrate the global governance structures that are dealing with the financial crisis with the structures that are dealing with environmental sustainability. Integrating these structures is the only way, to manage the sustainability transition that is needed in the time available. I have put 3 main points here. The first is that financial support programs, I already mentioned that 85 countries already have approached the IMF. Financial support programs by international financial institutions should stop be thought of and delivered, if you will, as economic adjustment program, and they should shift on a mode, a rationale of sustainability adjustment programs. At the core of this global governance structure is the debt sustainability analysis by the IMF and the World Bank. This assesses debt without integrating environmental implications of the economic policy suggested. Without changing this, we cannot really deliver the sustainability transition that is required. I have put 2 more recommendations on the need for new fiscal and accounting rules that support the transition to socio-environmental sustainability, like a green golden rule where investments in needed environmental infrastructure and climate adaptation and so on do not count for fiscal targets or debt targets related to financial support programs. And the need for international criteria for assessing vulnerability and concessional funding to change and integrate further SDG attainment. And I'm closing by saying that we are missing the target of $100 billion per year currently, but this will not, even if we meet the target, we will not, it is not enough to deliver the transition that we must see in the coming years. The only way forward is to go ahead with a massive quantitative easing program for the SDGs that will be funded by the issuance of special drawing rights by the IMF. I'm happy to come back to this point later on, but for now, let's conclude here this presentation. And it's with a great pleasure to pass the floor to Isabel Kampf. Isabel is the lead of the UN Bond program on integrating knowledge and capacity development for the SDGs. Has more than 25 years now, I think, Isabel, experience in the United Nations in key positions related to human rights, to development, and to poverty. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Isabel.
Thank you very much, Andreas. And I'm very happy to be here with my, poverty environment family and also the Sussex colleagues. Thanks for that. And I have to say that doing this research and this publication together with the Poverty Environment Action and also the Sussex colleague has been a real pleasure. And what I would like to present is not only the results of our research, but also the implications for developing thinking, because the role of the UN Research Institute for Social Development is really to kind of advance critical thinking, question development paradigms, and contribute to new kind of thinking and ideas. So yeah, so my presentation will be a little bit on the multiple crises and why we need a new eco-social contract. And I would like to start, next slide, please. Next, yeah, thank you. A little bit with the multiple crises. I mean, Andreas and Alexander have already talked about the financial crisis. In the publication, we look at both the financial crisis and of 2008, but also, of course, at the COVID crisis. And we can see that there has been very disparate progress in reducing poverty. Actually, since 2019, poverty at the global level has been coming up again. So the question of, very alarming, back please. Yeah, and the very alarming levels of wealth and income inequality. From 2016 onwards, we have the famous study from Oxfam, which showed that 1% of the population holds the same wealth as all the rest of the population in the world together. So an enormous concentration of wealth. And then also these multidimensional inequalities, often related to notions like gender and race, for example, where people suffer from multiple discriminations. The climate change and environmental destruction, and we have seen how biodiversity loss is also really very much related to climate change and need to be addressed at the same time. That's a very clear message coming out of Glasgow. Insecurity and conflict, and now the global health crisis. Next, please. So that leads us to call for a new eco-social contract, not only us, there are many other actors, and I will kind of share that in a moment. And the idea that the 20th century contract, which was basically, increase in productivity, growth, that will then shared with the workers and the population through universal social policies, or access to education, at least access to health and social services, has really broken down because not everyone is included in this. Let's think about informal workers, for example, migrants. Often in many societies, women are not part of that social contract. So there are more and more voices that are saying, the social contract is not working anymore. It has been broken down. And that, of course, inequalities have been rising, and that this idea of focusing on poverty eradication and on the poorest of the poor and targeting of the poor, I think we have seen that this cannot work in highly unequal systems, because the main problem is really the power asymmetries and inequality that's inherent in the system. Equally, there is a failure of the economic model to really account for planetary boundaries and leading to extreme weather events, climate change, and also health pandemics such as the COVID-19, which we are seeing now. So really, that is kind of the question, is the system really working? Next slide, please. And there are many different actors who are calling for a new social contract. There is a very interesting McKinsey report, which is entitled A New Social Contract for the 21st Century. And what do these different actors mean? Like in the business report, for example, this McKinsey report, they asked for kind of stakeholder capitalism, so make it more participatory. And then very interestingly, also that this idea that we know from the Development Corporation, the provision of services for better targeting of vulnerable groups. So basically, we don't change the system, but we make it work a little bit better and we target the vulnerable groups. That's also a little bit the kind of development thinking of the 1990s, I would say. Then the United Nations Secretary General has also been calling for a new social contract. What does he mean? in his kind of writings and speeches, we can see the idea of, equal rights and opportunities, especially kind of responding to, social movements such Black Lives Matter, for example, really asking for, universal social rights, such access to health, access to education, which of course with the COVID crisis has become really, really evident that that's a problem. But also looking at historical injustices, question of decolonization, indigenous peoples. And what I think is really interesting for the development thinking is this multilateral action on climate change and the environment. So what does he mean with this network multilateral action? I think this is kind of the idea that it's not only multilateralism amongst member states, but that's also multilateralism that kind of includes NGOs, civil society, and the private sector, because everyone kind of notices that in order to implement the SDG, we need a lot of finance, and we have to reallocate resources into SDG implementation, and also to combat climate change. Then the social and ecological movements, of course, are much more radical. They ask for more direct participation in decision-making, rights of future generations when they talk about eco-social contracts, and accountability measures. And of course, very urgent climate and environmental action. They said we cannot wait for another generation, action has to happen now. And therefore we need a new system because the present system is not delivering on action now. And then also the trade unions, which of course talk about the just transition, and then labor protection floors, to make sure that there's non-discrimination inclusion in the labor market. Thank you. Next. So how would a new eco-social contract that we are kind of, advocating for, how would that be different from the current one? First of all, there would be human rights for all, including, of course, women, indigenous peoples, but also, migrant workers and informal workers who are left out often because they're not kind of, part of the labor market. And a lot of the social rights are linked to participation in the labor market. Then a more progressive fiscal contract, and I will talk about that in a moment, transforming economies and societies through more sustainable production and consumption, a contract with nature, addressing historical injustices, because a lot of discrimination has historical causes. And when you think about indigenous peoples' rights to their land and territories, that's an interesting example where we can see, that historical injustices are continuing. When we think about racial discrimination, of course, there's a strong element of historical injustices. So how can we include this into our development thinking and policies? And then, of course, the question of gender justice, and finally, new forms of solidarity, because we have seen, as the Secretary General said, we're all safe, only all safe if everyone is safe. And that's in response to the COVID crisis. Thanks. Next one, please. So progressive fiscal policy, when we talk about this, there is the need to have a progressive fiscal policy that redistributes wealth and resources in a way that we can actually, afford and invest into urgent climate action and SDG implementation. And I think the COVID crisis, while of course the debt is rising, has also shown that there is a way to reallocate resources to important common goals. Then also to kind of have a more fair distribution of financing burden among countries made before climate change, also for SDG implementation. And the idea in the development cooperation kind of discussion to have a new multilateral agreement on financing the SDGs, debt relief, and innovative financing solutions, because again, both crises have shown how interrelated we are and that we have to find joint solutions to this. Thanks. Next. Then the idea of transformative economies and societies that are really kind of based on the, where we're addressing root causes of the problems, and really kind of come up with policies that propose structural, normative, and behavioral change at the same time. And then to really tackle these inequalities and power asymmetries through social policies that are based on universal approaches. In our chapter in the joint publication that we have done for the sustainable development, we have clearly shown that those countries who had universal social policies in place, it was much easier to respond to the COVID crisis. It was much faster. They had systems in place that they could expand, so they were most of the time more successful. And those countries who had disinvested in, for example, health services, really suffered, first when the crisis set in. And then the question, how can we combine universal social policies with alternative economic approaches and just transition for all strategies? Next one, please. And then again, the question, how can we include into the new eco-social contract, our contract with nature, recognizing that we are not kind of the economy is not outside, the planet and nature. How can we kind of make sure that this complexity, the relationship between nature and the economy, that's really taken into account? How can we contribute to behavioral change when it comes to consumption and production? And then also kind of look at alternative visions, like when Vivir, Ubuntu, where we really kind of discuss what is the common good and how can we restructure the economy so that it works for the common good. Thanks. Next one, please. Then we also have kind of discussed in our research and in the different chapters, what are the kind of solutions that have been proposed by different actors. Here I've singled out a little bit what the Secretary General said with regard to the Corona crisis. How can we really kind of make sure that there is a just and green transition when we now de-invest in fossil fuels? How can we make sure that there is also a public discussion, on what are we going to invest in, not only infrastructure and green, and green energy, but really what are kind of, other passes that with regard to agriculture, for example. I know the PI has always been drawing to the fact that in Africa, agriculture is one of the most important sector when it comes to the links between poverty and environment. How can we make sure that there is, a social and a green element? And how can we combine social and environmental and climate justice? Next one, please. So in order to discuss these topics, we have created together with the Green Economy Coalition, which is a coalition of different civil society organizations, private business, but also international organizations, by creating this new global research and action network. And the Sussex colleagues are already part of that network. We launched it now in November, on the 11th of November. And the idea is to bring really kind of researchers, but also social activists and decision makers together, because we found that the advocacy that's needed to sustain this debate and really make that systemic changes is really, really important. So we want to create this space and also bring in a lot of the voices from the South, from different programs, activities to that discussion. And in order to show a little bit what the network will be about, we would like to share a small video with you.
Over the last 18 months, COVID-19 has driven 75 million people out of work and 120 million into extreme poverty. Over that same period, the wealth of the world's billionaires more than doubled, from 5 trillion to 13 trillion. How is this possible? We know the system isn't working. Inequality is accelerating, nature is vanishing, democracy is decaying. We need something new, a new vision of a fair and sustainable world, and the rights and responsibilities that will make it work. In short, a new eco-social contract for the 21st century. This new contract needs solid foundations, human rights, and rights for the natural world. It needs many forms of justice. Work must be decent, and diversity is key. Many different voices are calling for transformative change, from the United Nations to Black Lives Matter, from the World Economic Forum to the International Trade Union Congress. To catalyse this diverse movement, UNRWA has teamed up with the Green Economy Coalition to launch a new global research and action network for a new eco-social contract. The network will join the dots between climate justice and social justice. Working with us will be partners from different communities and sectors: advocacy, practice, research and policy making. We're uniting to build a new understanding of how to structure our societies for a green and fair future. Join us and help construct a new eco-social contract that is sustainable, equitable and ready for the 21st century.
Thanks for that. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Isabel. Without delay, let me pass now the floor to Dr. Amir Ansari, who has a long experience on poverty reduction research and programs on the ground based in Karachi now, and has been working on policy recommendation across the poverty environment nexus for our project. Amir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andreas, and hi to everybody in the team. My discussion talk would be just like a reflection of your talk, because I would be focusing on the recommendations from different research appeared in universities of Oxford, Queensland, York, London, as well as overseas development institution in UK, and from development partners including UNEP and OECD. So let me share my presentation with you. So these are the main recommendations, and these recommendations will be actually a reflection of your thoughts, and because these recommendations comes from the recently conducted research. So I divide these policy recommendations at different levels: at national level, international and regional level, and private sector level. So first of all, as UNEP suggests, these resolutions, these recommendations, they lead us to national climate solutions, where duly emphasis is on subsidy swap for fossil fuels to fund clean energy investments, as well as subsidy swap for irrigation to reduce the inequalities in allocation of water to irrigate lands, especially for example, in developing countries, where the allocation of land is one of the you can say the symbol of social inequalities, economic inequalities. And then it suggests tropical carbon tax, and it mainly emphasized to finance conservation and to have reduce carbon in the environment and reduce deforestation. And these recommendations have already been adopted in some countries, for example, Costa Rica and Colombia, and they are still successful. But there is a need that the more and more countries they adopt these national climate solutions. Likewise, OECD focuses on green growth, and its focus is investing in skills and innovation in clean and sustainability economy. They focus on access to long-run sustainable livelihoods matched with the nature, diversified in nature. They focus on showcasing and promoting opportunities of small and large-scale investments. And again, like internalize fiscal and monetary incentives. So there is a need that mm, the fiscal and monetary incentives, they are in agreement with the environmental sustainability, because as Isabel and Alexander and Andreas, they focus like we are actually in the we are like mm, uh, trying to create existing structures of production and expenditures. Definitely, we need like to integrate, to internalize these economic structures, as well as these component of fiscal and monetary incentives with the nature, with the environment. Uh, and again, like environmental and labor rules as a condition in any bailout support to the private sector. So whenever we have like in a situation when we have to bail out the private sector, so these considerations like where the labor laws and the labor environmental laws, they should be like prerequisites of any bailout package to the businesses. Again, promotion of awareness on potential and impending climate and ecological crisis, together public support. Actually, it's a major issue in developing countries and low-income countries, because of lack of awareness. The public policies, even though it's directed to set some larger societal goals, but its implementation is incomplete or is frustrated by non-awareness of climate issues. Uh, Engagement with the community level to enable sustainable use of natural resources. Community and indigenous organizations already operational in the field can play a key role. So role of local communities, organizations cannot be underestimated. When we call for a collective approach for environmental sustainability. So these are the like organizations, entities working on ground actually. They have understanding of their environment, their conditions, and the solutions or the policies for the local level uh, would be very relevant for the design as well as implementation of such policies. And the second point, the next point, interventions under community-based adaptation models effectively address the issue of free ridership. Again, if things are, if the policy is designed with the help of information, local information, so definitely the issue of free ridership so is can be reduced. So in that case, like everybody is part of the drive when we are as a community, as a nation, as a globe, we are creating awareness as well as trying to make like nature green. Apart from OECD, the Center for International Governance Innovation, CIGI, in its widely circulated publication report, Environmental Sustainability and the Financial Crisis, Linkages and Policy Recommendation, it notes, emphasizes on multiple criteria when economic stimulus packages are like it comes to design those packages. So sustainability should must also be part of that multiple criteria, multiple factor criteria, that the solutions, that the economic stimulus packages, they are not for a shorter run. Actually, they should be sustainable for a longer time. Green stimulus package should incentivize energy efficiency investments. The International Energy Agency supports them because they potentially meet both the short-term economic goals and long-term energy and climate goals. So like green stimulus packages, definitely they are more directed to the environment. So they are desired more than any other like economic stimulus packages. It also focuses on providing assistance to developing countries to help them reduce their dependence on food imports. There should be help to have their own to cater to their own food needs. So for that purpose, they should be provided assistance. Promote sustainable finance to mobilize. I think Alex referred to this point in his presentation, that there should be like a sizable, adequate finance, and they should be available for a longer time to mobilize and align financing for SDGs. So these sources, these finances may be from public sector as well as private sector. And then we can use the available policy tools. For example, we are having this PA webinars on green public finance, green private finance, on blue economy available on YouTube. So it's a way of exchange of ideas and improving the understanding as well. At the national level, because this approach must be a collective, so nobody should be left behind in any recovery action plan, focusing on environment and addressing the needs of the most vulnerable and marginalized people. Decentralization of authority and power is again the major factor, which is compatible with the engagement with the local community, and principle of subsidiarity is here because the implementation or even in the design of the policies leading to a green economy, actually it's more it has more to do with the subnational level. So for that purpose, the capacity of the subnational governments should be increased so that they're able to give their input when the policies are formulated at the national level or subnational level. And those definitely recommendations or input would be very relevant for for promotion of their livelihoods and environmental sustainability. To preempt the negative multidimensional effects of poverty and related environmental impacts stemming from issues of national debt and burdens on human development, coordinated actions to address debt sustainability of low-income developing countries and mid-income developing countries is called for, including through debt for nature jobs. So it's a major issue these days because the most of the fiscal resources, they are consumed for repayment of debt. So there is little left for development or investing in social sector. So this is very important element, especially for lower income and middle income countries. One of the recommendation for international level, for the international and regional level, to identify, address, and provide remedy to the environmental, social, and governance risks to ensure sustainable supply chains, support a binding treaty on business and human rights, and national, regional, and international sustainable supply chain legislation. Improve tax governance, follow progressive fiscal policy, and ensure investment as well as reinvestment in green and create green jobs. So it's like a total package where we have the focus is on the social governance, environmental governance, and improving the fiscal space by mobilizing taxes and investment in green economy and green jobs. Support the adoption by regional parties and implementation of key COP26 partnerships. So there are certain agreements pledged made by the parties, the countries, and these are very significant if they are implemented worldwide, globally. It will have very significant effect if we reduce global methane emissions by 13% by 2030 from the benchmark level of 2020. More than 100 parties signed the pledge that agree to take national level voluntary actions to contribute to reduce global methane emissions. Scientists believe this could eliminate around 0.2 degrees Celsius of warming by year 2050. So the global methane pledge is very significant for the recovery of the climate. If we are able to reduce methane gases. Another point of agreement is end deforestation by 2030. It has been signed by more than 141 countries. The Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest and Land Use aims to conserve and restore forests by 2030. So again, they have provided like adequate funds of $19.2 billion for public and private funds to support this initiative. So hopefully, like with the availability of funds, this pledge is going to be realized.
Amir, 2 more minutes.
Okay, I'm trying to finish it. So again, the another element of COP26 is coal transition and phasing out the coal power to the clean energy. And for that purpose, there is a provision of $17.8 billion to support to have clean energy. I think I should come to the last slides because there are like a race to zero cities, cooling and vehicles. Again, it aims to support cities targeting net zero. And cooling, 14 cooling suppliers have joined this drive, and 13 countries have agreed to work together to make zero emission vehicle in all regions by 2030. Increase, so like if we have implementation on these pledges, so hopefully on the environmental side, we would have a significant impact by year 2030. But again, availability of funds, sustainable funds, main prerequisites for this. So I think one last, I think the word I should share this, and Isabel mentioned it, like we have to like for new social contracts, so support solidarity economy, which is based on actually the based on the values of democratization and social profitability rather than financial profitability. I think this is the main crux that we have to like focus on, that social profitability, then like not only the human beings but the nature is part of the your solidarity economy. So that's it, I think, from my side. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Amir. Now, please let me open the floor for comments, questions, contributions that you may have. We very much welcome oral contributions. So if you would like to make a comment, feel free to use the raise hand function, and our moderator will give you the floor. We very much welcome also comments from members of our team that they have written studies and they are attending today to briefly mention their own take on poverty and environment in conditions of crisis. We have 15 to 20 minutes for discussion. Can we please give the floor to Madhavan Palan, please?
Hello. Oh, great. It was actually mine as a comment. It was great to see a lot of good VNRs in the COP26 event. with respect to climate action and economic development. Thank you.
Thank you, Madhavan Palanmai. If you would like to introduce yourselves and say your organization, where you are coming from, please do so.
My name is Madhavan. I do come from United Nations Focus Group for Artificial Intelligence. I'm part of AI community in many organizations around the community. I do work in data as well as research topics, actually. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Madhavan. Jonathan?
Yes, thank you. Actually, I have a question for Isabel about the new eco-social contract and the network. To what extent are you involving private companies in the network? Because something that strikes me is that as we're looking at a new way of operating, how do we change the way that publicly listed companies on stock exchanges, for example, are all driven by profits? How can we integrate, for example, staff welfare or environmental impacts into a sort of a company's performance measure more formally rather than just profit? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think two things. First of all, we have already been approached by a few companies. For example, the Bosch Foundation, and the Bosch, is a big renewable energy and electricity company, that they are already kind of asked to be a member, and the JEC has quite a few already kind of enterprises that work on sustainability. But I think we would like to we want to go a little bit beyond the question of, this voluntary social responsibility, because one of the reasons why we really talk about the eco-social contract, because we really want to have an emphasis on legal changes, because we have seen that, neither market mechanisms nor voluntary kind of social responsibility by the private sector have led to any reduction in CO2 emissions, and also not to better environmental protection. So that's why we're looking at things like, for example, sustainable supply chains. What kind of legislation do you need? And then work also with the private sector, of course, on financing of being reallocated into green agriculture and into just transition initiatives. So while we work together with the private sector, and we have invited them, and as I said, there's already interest from some private sector actors, I think it needs to be clear that we will go beyond this kind of, the voluntary guidelines for companies. We're really looking at more systemic change. And of course, I think the private sector should be part of that, yes. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Isabel. Let me pass the floor to Christopher Rosado, who has contributed to one of the studies in our project on Indonesia. Chris, the floor.
Hello, everybody. Hello. Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to represent some of the marine data that we've collected from Indonesia. So my concern is about some of the impacts that I saw through the small-scale fishers, and many of the impacts do resonate with the more satellite view of the information that's been provided. But I have a question to throw out to the floor. What is your perspective on ocean plastics, particularly because COVID-19 exacerbated the use of single-use plastic and medical waste? And on the ground here, we can see when we did a shifting baseline, looking at the impacts from COVID-19 and the lack of waste management. What is your interest or ideas around ocean plastics impacts? And then as well as roles of communities with integration into like more formalized, sophisticated management systems.
Great, thank you very much, Christopher. Would anyone like from the floor would like to take this one?
I could talk a little bit about our some of our original research, Andreas. So thanks, Christopher. one of the founding ideas of our work on financial crisis and this slower growth rate period that we investigate, this great stagnation, was to link it to waste production, waste management, and ocean plastics. One of our key contacts was someone that was at Sussex IDS and now is at Chatham House, Patrick Schroeder, who knows a lot more than us on waste. And we did start to investigate the idea of including waste management and ocean plastic into that. We did not find globally consistent data sets to do this, but it is something that still interests us quite heavily. So any comments on that or any future work on that would be welcome.
Thank you, Alexander.
Yeah, I would like to kind of, can I just ask a little bit what the colleague from Zambia has just put into?
Yes, it's okay.
Sorry, yeah. What the colleague from Zambia, because I see that also happening in Germany and in many other countries, the question of inflation coming up now. Maybe that would be really interesting to see that, as an impact of the crisis, the question of inflation and how that will impact on inequality and also on the environment. Especially, for example, here in Germany, we see a very big increase in gas, in the cost of gas, and of course of petrol, which could on one hand be a really good thing, because then hopefully people, will have an incentive to change to alternative energies more rapidly. But it would be interesting to see how that discussion is going on in developing countries. So I would really like to hear from the colleague who wrote that comment from Zambia, from Richard, please.
Richard, would you like to step in? Can we give you the floor?
Okay, thank you for giving me the floor. Yeah, I'm Richard Wadia, a research fellow at the University of Zambia Institute of Economic and Social Research. Yeah, I just thought this is quite interesting because as Zambia, I think we are just in more or less like a transition, moving from one government to the other. And yeah, what's happening right now, like due to COVID that we had a rapid slowdown in economic growth. Poverty, of course, increasing with a lot of people like falling, not being able to manage to get even the bare necessities. So that probably contributed a bit to the change in government that we had this year in August. But then the new government comes in with a very nice elaborate plan in terms of how they are going to grow the economy and at least reduce the poverty levels. But already what we are seeing is that that's going to be a very big challenge with the new Omicron variant of COVID that has come in. The government is already closing down borders. Supply chains are likely to be disrupted. And they are, from the look of things right now, the projections that they made in terms of how they are going to fund the next year's budget, it looks like they have to make drastic changes to take into account the changes in the that are being brought in by COVID. And then we're already seeing that by now, normally we should have started receiving rainfall, but the rainfall pattern is looking bad. So chances are we are going to face serious challenges. And normally what happens in that case is that people resort to, particularly in the rural areas, they resort to unsustainable measures to just like get through. So yeah, it's a very good discussion, and hopefully discussions like this are likely to provide some kind of solutions to the problem that we are likely to go into, because the government is not likely to fund its budget. So it's highly likely that they are going to borrow much more than what they plan to borrow if they have to maintain what they planned, or drastically reduce in terms of what they had planned to do. So we are actually in a bad situation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Richard. We have time for 2-3 more questions or interventions. May I also step in on the question of inflation? I think this is one of the greatest threats at the moment, is that the inflation trend, especially in advanced economies, we may speed up the monetary normalization, the increase in interest rates in the core. And this is the traditional mechanism that we have seen for financial crisis in developing economies. Monetary normalization in the United States and the ECB in Europe will lead automatically, if you will, to capital outflows from developing economies, to further downgrade in exchange rates of local currencies, and of course a significant increase in debt servicing. This is something that there is no way the developing world can deal with, if you will, in the current conditions, and there is no way that we will manage our transition to sustainability in these conditions. Let me see if we have any other comments or questions. I don't see any other comments and questions. Jonathan, would you like to take the floor? May I just briefly introduce Jonathan? Jonathan is the Regional Policy Coordinator of Poverty and Environment Action based in the Asia Pacific office in UNEP. He has been a driving force behind this joint initiative, and he will conclude with some thoughts the webinar. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andreas, and thank you, most of all, participants for sitting through today and our presentations and for the Q&A. And thanks, of course, to you, Andreas, for shepherding us today, and your colleague Alexander from the University of Sussex, and Isabel also, and Dr. Amir. Excuse me, one thing that struck me during this process of us working together was that traditionally UN agencies, we work a lot with CSOs, with governments, with other UN agencies, but not enough, I think, with research institutes and universities. And I think it's important to get to work with you to get different perspectives. And the whole philosophy of the SDGs is that we should adopt an integrated approach to support to working with governments and communities to achieve the SDGs. And just to give an example more specifically, what was brought to the table today in your analysis, which I actually haven't seen before in discussions of recovery, COVID recovery. Excuse me, colleagues. As working for UNEP, I've been involved in a lot of work looking at green recovery in the last couple of years with governments and partners. But this is the first time I've heard the IMF being mentioned, which is strange because they would obviously be key to any recovery process. And I think there is scope for us to increase our engagement with the IMF. We are working more with development banks within the UN, but one takeaway for me is that we do need to reach out to them, because not only do they give loans, but of course they give technical assistance support as well on financial issues. And how can we engage with them to think about these more sustainable and green issues to integrate into their programs? And of course, the IMF is part of the UN system. I just double checked in an organogram, and they are part of the UN system, although they operate very independently from us. And also another example, the new eco-social contract that Isabel was talking about. This type of innovative thinking, I think we can learn from this and get more new ideas by engaging with a greater number and variety of partners, including research institutes. The last thing, I saw my notes as well regarding the IMF, the idea of SDG focused quantitative easing. I think that's an idea worth exploring. But I just wanted to end by thanking everyone here today. And as has been mentioned a few times already, we are preparing a draft policy brief And actually, we'd be pleased to share the draft policy brief with participants of today's webinar to get your feedback on that. The more that we can share that and the more ideas we can put in there, the better. So with that, let me say thank you all for participating, and thank you, Andreas, for moderating today. Bye.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. Just to closing remark to say that the recording will be available at the Poverty and Environment Action website. We will send you the link to all the participants, and we look forward to our next meeting. Thank you all.